Good morning, everyone, and welcome to NParks Spotlight. My name is Leslie, and I'm from the National Biodiversity Centre at the National Parks Board. Thank you all for joining us on Zoom and YouTube today. Since June, we have been getting to know the fascinating creatures and habitats of our city in nature. And we still have so much more to share. So stay tuned to the very end to find out about some exciting activities that we have lined up next month. For now, I hope that you're all set for the 12th talk in the NParks Spotlight series. Here to tell us what's the buzz about bees is my colleague Zestin Soh. You may know of bees as key pollinators of our food crops, but with over 100 species of bees in Singapore, they really do so much more in keeping our ecosystems healthy. More on that soon. But first, here is our program for today. For those on Zoom, if you have any questions during the talk, please send them to me, Leslie, as a private message using the chat, and we'll try to address a few of them later on. We are almost ready, but as we have a short interactive portion coming up, I'd like you to take a moment to scan this QR code or type www.menti.com in an internet browser and just keep this handy for later on. I'll give you a few moments to do so. Okay, we will move on with our program. If you haven't gotten the web page open yet, not to worry, we will send the link in the chat again later on. So right now, we present to you Befriending the Bees. Let's give a warm welcome to Zestin Soh, Senior Manager at the Horticulture and Operations Branch at the Singapore Botanic Gardens Division. Over to you, Zestin.
Thanks, Leslie. Hi, everyone. Hi, my name is Zestin. I'm from the Singapore Botanic Gardens. Thanks for joining me this morning. Today, I'll be sharing a little bit about the amazing bees that you can find in Singapore, and hopefully encourage some of you to start befriending these fascinating insects. As we begin, I thought it would be great if I could get a bit of an understanding of how you and the audience think and feel about bees in Singapore. So it'd be great if you could use your mobile phone or computer to access this Menti link, input a code above, and submit answers to two simple questions. The first question is a word association. What are some words or short phrases would you use to describe a bee if somebody were to ask you? Maybe think a bit about its appearance, how it looks like, where it lives, or how it lives, or what it does. So I'll give everyone some time to input their answers and we'll see what we get. Okay, so we are getting a variety of different answers, but I can see a big one that appeared early on is sting. So yes, many bees do have the ability to sting, and it's something that we'll be talking a little bit more in a short while. Honey is also coming up, and that is a very beneficial thing that bees do, and that we can enjoy as a product of the honeybees. And I think it's one of the things that we think about first. Okay, so there's some other variety. There's a variety of different things. So things on their role as pollinators and their importance to biodiversity. Some things on their appearance, that they're stripy, that the black and yellow. Wow, lots of different answers coming in. Thanks so much for sharing your different inputs. Okay, and also the idea that they're yellow and black. So that's a bit of their color. So thanks so much for all these answers. I think we'll stop here. So there's a variety of different things that we've seen. So some of these are true for all bees, but some of them actually only apply to a few kinds of bees. And there are actually misconceptions about bees. So I'll be sharing and elaborating about these a lot more in the talk later on. The second question that I have is a bit more personal. I'd like to understand a bit more about how you feel about bees. So if you were to read about bees or hear about them, what are some of the first emotions that come to mind? Okay, I'm seeing some answers to do with fear of bees. And I think that's a really natural response towards bees because they do have the ability to sting. And it's an important concern that I'll be addressing a bit more in this talk. And we'll learn a little bit on the situations where bees or particular species of bee may sting us, and situations where we can actually interact with bees safely and we can even view them up close. So there are situations where we can do so, and I'll be talking more about that later. There's also aspects on that bees are fascinating and interesting. I hope to share more about more fascinating facts about bees, and they're hardworking and exciting. Okay, great. Thanks so much all for your input here. I'll share a bit more about these things and try to talk a little bit more about them as I begin this talk. Okay, so why the buzz about bees? So this is probably the question that I get most often when I tell people that I'm really interested in bees. I love them and I love studying them. So I'll share a bit about some of the reasons why I think we should bother about bees and care about them. The first one that is probably the most personal and impactful to us, especially as Singaporeans, is food. So bees are really important for providing us a rich variety of fruits, vegetables, and nuts that we enjoy. And we wouldn't be able to enjoy this studying diversity in our food if not for bee pollination. And it's not just food, but also some beverages, including coffee, which you may have had this morning. It's also bee pollinated. And if you're more of a meat lover, actually, bees are important too because they pollinate a lot of the feed that goes to feeding livestock like alfalfa. So without bees, we wouldn't have a lot of food. But we often think that this important service of pollinating food crops happens just overseas. In fact, right here in Singapore, in our backyards, bees are also playing this important service. So if you visit community gardens or allotment gardens, whether in our parks or on your rooftops, actually you'll find a diverse array of bees hard at work pollinating a variety of different edible plants that we grow here in Singapore, from long beans to longans. So on the left here, you can see a allotment garden in HortPark. And this is a place that I like to visit to see some of what the bees are up to. And some of the photos that you can see here are some of the pictures that I've taken there. So you can see some bees, a pearly-banded bee in the top left-hand corner visiting a sword bean, which is one of the Asian plants that we often grow and we eat here. And you can see some things that are very familiar, like chilies and okra, long beans, and mango. These are also pollinated in part by bees. So aside from food, bees are also important in supporting our natural ecosystem and supporting biodiversity. A lot of the native plants that are found in our natural habitats rely on bee pollination. These include some which are locally threatened and plants in habitats such as mangroves. So on the left, you can see sea holly and seashore ardesia, which are both mangrove plants. And you can see them here being pollinated by native pearly-banded bees. Some plants as well in our lowland dipterocarp rainforest, such as Bukit Timah Nature Reserve. So this species is the tiger orchid in the middle. So this plant is actually it's actually nationally extinct, but it's part of the orchid reintroduction program run by NParks. And you can see here a native black forest, a native bee that's forest associated, that's all black. It almost looks like a wasp, but it's actually a type of solitary bee. And it's actually visiting the flower. And on its back, you can see two lumps of pollen containing pollen of the orchid. So these lumps are known as pollinia. And in the bottom, you can see that bees also pollinate plants found in swamp forests, including this aquatic plant known as the water gentian, which we may not associate immediately as being bee pollinated because it's found in ponds. On a larger scale, bees are also important in maintaining ecosystems by pollinating forests. So on the right, you can see this tree, this very large native tree called Kempas, which is locally endangered in Singapore. The scientific name is Compasia melicensis. So this plant, this tree is found in forest patches around Singapore. And research in Singapore found that actually this tree was more diverse genetically than expected. And they found that actually giant honeybees were playing an important role in flying between these forest patches and pollinating these trees and acting as conduits for gene flow. So bees, you can see, are really important for supporting plants, and in the process, they form habitats and support biodiversity that rely on these habitats. So the reason why bees can play this important role, whether it's in food or in supporting our natural ecosystems, is because they're really excellent pollinators. So bees are, as you can see on the left, they will visit flowers and gather lots of pollen. And sometimes in the process, they can be a little bit messy and they'll drop pollen here and there. And that's really good for the plant because it pollinates flowers. And they're really equipped for the job. If you use a microscope and look really up close at the bees' hairs, you'll see on the bottom left photo that they look like feathers. The hairs are actually branched. So these branched hairs actually allow them to collect pollen and carry it back from flower to flower or back to their nest. So this trait is actually very special and it's unique to bees and is what separates them from their closest relatives, the wasps, which actually have simple hairs that are unbranched. Aside from these tools of the trait, bees also have special abilities which they use in order to access pollen and pollinate flowers better. So I'm going to show a video of one of these special abilities known as buzz pollination. So here you can see a carpenter bee. As soon as she visits the flower, she buzzes, and the process she releases, that causes the flower to release a large amount of pollen. So I'll play the video again. So this bee, when she lands on the flower, she buzzes at a very special frequency that causes the flower to release pollen. So without this buzzing action, the flower actually doesn't release any pollen. So it's a very special relationship between bees and flowers. And the flower actually wouldn't be pollinated by just any visitor, only by a particular species of bees that can do this action of buzz pollination. Another reason to be excited about bees, especially those found in Singapore, is that there's actually so much more to discover about them. So just over the last 10 years, we've had over 40 new species records for Singapore. And I've had the really good privilege of being able to be part of discovering some of these species and seeing some of them myself. So one really fascinating one is in the middle. This species of solitary bee is actually known to nest in beach sand and it's found mostly in our coastal areas. But just recently this year, we discovered it actually nesting in some sandy areas in fitness corners as well. And in the top right-hand corner, you can see a resin bee. And this bee was discovered in 2013 at Dairy Farm. And just recently this year, we found it also nesting in bee hotels at HortPark. And I'll share a bit more about what bee hotels are later on. In addition to new records, some of these bees that we found also are likely to be new to science. And this is one species of forest nomia that's found mainly in our nature parks, but also in places like the Singapore Botanic Gardens. So you can see it's a very impressive looking animal. On the left, you can see in the male, they have two blunt spines on the thorax, and the wings, there are blotches at the end. So it's quite a distinctive species. But I think what's most exciting for me and most interesting was recently actually found this bee on the right visiting brinjal or eggplant in our local community garden. It was actually pollinating the plant. So it's quite amazing that here in Singapore, you can actually find new species right in our backyards when it comes to insects and bees. Like bees, you don't have to travel to a remote, pristine area where no one has visited in order to find new species of science. But you can do it right here in Singapore with bees. Another reason why we might be concerned about bees is the idea that they're dying out. And often we hear news about this, that bees are really in need of conservation. But actually, there's a little bit of misconceptions surrounding this, and I'd like to just clarify a bit more about this aspect. So when we hear in the news and media often about how bees are declining, it's usually just associated with one species, which is this one on the left, the European honeybee. So this bee is non-native to Singapore and it's not found in Singapore here either. Instead, it's actually domesticated worldwide for honey and farming. So it's been introduced in many areas, including the US and Australia and New Zealand, and farmed to make honey, including honey like Manuka. And when the media outlets often share about bee declines, they talk about this species and how colonies of them, which are managed and domesticated, are die out due to various issues such as pests or mites and diseases, or something which they like to term as colony collapse disorder. So there is a lot of concern about that and how that might affect food production. But actually, in truth, this only applies to one species, and one species that's domesticated and farmed. The bigger, wider concern is actually truly about native bees, whether worldwide or here in Singapore, bees which are not farmed and not kept as livestock like honeybees are, like the European honeybees are. So these native bees, especially in Singapore, they're actually much more poorly known, and there's relatively little research being done on them, particularly here in Singapore, because there hasn't been long-term research on their populations. So a lot more research is needed to truly understand how these bees are doing. And I'll share a bit more about how you can play a part in contributing information so that we can better understand the bees. And that brings me, I guess, to my next section on how there are quite a number of misconceptions about bees. And I'll address these bee myths one at a time. I think I'll share about 4 bee myths here. The first bee myth that I often hear and that I had before I started studying about bees is the idea that there could only be a few kinds of bees in Singapore, especially because you often see just a few kinds being depicted, whether it's in textbooks or on television or in the supermarkets. Usually it's this species in the bottom left, the honeybee. So this bee is found in Singapore. This is a different one from the one that I mentioned. This is the Asian honeybee. It's a native honeybee found in Singapore. But again, it just fits our usual idea of what a bee is. In truth, bees are actually really diverse. Just in Singapore alone, we have over 130 different bee species. And you can see they come in all shapes and sizes and different colors. They're really amazing. In the middle is one of the most common kinds of bees, a bee that you might have seen. Some people do mistake it as sometimes it's a large beetle or as a bumblebee, which we don't have in Singapore. This is actually a kind of carpenter bee, and it likes visiting large flowers like this elephant climber in HortPark. So we have many different kinds of bees in Singapore, and they're not just diverse in species, but in appearance, as I alluded to. So one way is in size. So on the left, you can see that the carpenter bee that I just talked about, the broad-footed carpenter bee, which is the largest bee in Singapore. But sharing the flower, you can see 2 other species of bee also on that flower. One is a species of Stingless bee, those small black ones, and also pearly-banded bees with the bright, almost rainbow-colored bands. Bees are also diverse, sometimes in their activity. And in Singapore, we do have one species of bee that is nocturnal, this bee on the right, the Sunda night carpenter bee. And it's found in our nature reserves and nature parks. So in the middle, between the eyes of the bee, you can see these organs that look like pearls. So these are actually simple light sensing organs that all bees have. But in this nocturnal species, they are greatly enlarged. And that allows it to really navigate at night when there's low light, so using the light of the moon alone. Some bees are also sometimes diverse in the food and nesting resources. So on the left, you can see a bee that's actually one of the specialists that I found in Singapore. And this bee only visits grasses and collects pollen from grasses, which is quite surprising because grass is known to be wind pollinated. But this bee has relies on these grasses for pollen, and it can be found in our neighborhood parks and gardens. Some bees also rely on unusual resources and materials to build a nest. So on the right, you can see a species of leafcutter bee, which I'll be talking a bit more later, and how they use leaves to build a nest. Another myth that is associated to what I just talked about is the idea that bees are black and yellow. But I hope, as you've seen through the photos so far, actually the bees of Singapore are stunningly diverse, and they come in an array of different colors. So from blue to red to green. And sometimes these different colors also appear in the same species of bee. So these two bees that I hope you can see my pointer circling, these are actually the same species of bee, but there's different variation within the species. And sometimes different species of bee also may have different colors depending on the different sex. So over here, you can see actually carpenter bees of the same species. The female is black and yellow, and the male is entirely yellow. But I think the most interesting bees of all are those that are blue. And in Singapore, actually, we have a few blue bees, and they've actually become quite famous internationally. The one on the left is probably the most charismatic one. It's known as the cerulean carpenter bee. It's about the size of my thumb, so it's a fairly large, robust bee. And this species has actually been featured on Singapore stamp. This bee is is usually found in nature parks and nature reserves, and it often visits trees such as this tube tree. On the right is actually a much lesser known and much rarer species, and it's a smaller one than the cerulean carpenter bee, known as the blue-sided carpenter bee. It's much rarer, and some scientists think that potentially it could be a species that only comes out in the early morning at dawn, and as well as at dusk, so late in the evenings. And that's why it could be so rare. But if you want to have a chance of spotting these bees, one of the best places to do so is in Cambridge Park, especially at the treetop walk. When the trees are in bloom, you can sometimes see 3 or 4 of these bees buzzing around. Another 2 kinds of blue bees in Singapore that are much more common in our urban parks and gardens are, on the left, the Sunda blue-banded digger bee, and on the right, the Himalayan cloak and dagger bee. The blue-banded digger bee on the left is a very common species which has these beautiful bright blue bands, and it's a very erratic, fast flyer. So sometimes you have to wait at some of its preferred flowers, which are often butterfly-attracting flowers, and you can see it whizzing by really quickly. And sometimes it pauses momentarily on the flower to drink nectar, and that's when you can really appreciate its beauty. So next to it, you can see some bees, and there's a black background. The reason to that is because it's actually a photo taken at night. So these are the male blue-banded digger bees, and because they are not involved in actually constructing the nest, they are actually found sleeping outdoors like this. So they will often find a branch or twig, and they'll latch onto it with their mandibles, and they'll spend the night like this outdoors. On the right, the Himalayan cloak and dagger bee is really a stunning and beautiful species, and it really blew my mind the first time I laid eyes on this species. So this bee is almost entirely blue with black markings, and it's a very graceful floating flight. And when you see it in real life in a park or garden, it really almost looks like a fairy. So I highly recommend visiting your parks and gardens and looking out for this bee. So you can really see these bees in almost every park and garden in Singapore, and even your local community garden, you can see them visiting. The third myth has to do with the way bees live. When we think about bees, we often think that they're colonial, that they live in big societies of many individuals of the same species, with one individual known as the queen, which lays eggs. This is true of only 2 kinds of bees in Singapore, the honeybees, which are the familiar ones, as well as the stingless bees. These bees just form actually only 17 species locally. The vast majority of bees in Singapore and worldwide are actually non-colonial. So these bees are either solitary, semi-social, or cuckoo bees. So unlike the colonial bees, they don't build hives and they don't make honey. So I'll be sharing a little bit more about both these groups of bees. First, I'll start with sharing about the colonial bees found in Singapore, then the non-colonial ones. So first up are the honeybees. So these are the most familiar ones to us, and it's the one depicted often in our supermarkets, in textbooks, and in Winnie the Pooh. So these bees are, they often spot the famous black and yellow coloration. And another way to identify that it's a honeybee is by looking at the way it collects pollen. So on the hind leg, it collects pollen as a moist lump. And it uses its hind leg, which has a feature known as a pollen basket. So it's broad, and it actually has long recurved hairs that form that basket to hold the pollen in place. So as we know, these bees live in big colonies, as you can see on the right. And you can see, if you look at a hive of bees, you can often see these bees covering it like a curtain. And there are many of these individual workers, and among them, one single individual that lays the eggs, the queen. And the hive that they build is made of beeswax, which the honeybees secrete. The hive is formed of hexagonal cells, and they use these cells firstly to store pollen, store honey, but also to raise their young. So in this image, you can see eggs of honeybees, a single egg laid in each cell. And some of these cells, you can also see a developing bee grub. And this young bee will develop into adult. And in the last image, you can see this adult bee, drone, a male bee, actually emerging from the cell. The second group of colonial bees found in Singapore are the stingless bees. So these bees, they don't look anything like honeybees, but they're actually quite closely related. So one of the ways that they're related by, and you can tell, is by the way that, again, the way they collect pollen. So if you look at the hind leg, you can see it's expanded, and they've collected pollen as a moist lump. So they also have pollen baskets. Stingless bees also use these pollen baskets, not just for collecting pollen, but to collect resin as well. So in the top right image, you can see the bee has collected droplets of resin from the wound of a tree. And she uses this actually to build the nest. So in the bottom left, you can see the hive of the stingless bee. The hive is constructed not solely out of beeswax, but also mixed with these plant resin which they collect. And it doesn't look anything like a honeybee's nest. There are no hexagonal cells. It almost looks like an alien landscape of pods with connectives between them. So these little pods or pots are used for storing pollen, storing nectar, and which they make into honey, or also for raising their young. So if you look really closely at these pods on the bottom left, you can just make out the eyes of young bees which are developing within them. And in the bottom right, you can see the individual that is very famous of colonial bees, the queen. So she's much larger than the rest of the workers surrounding her, and she's the only individual that lays eggs. So these are the two colonial bees found in Singapore. Sorry, one additional question that I often get about stingless bees is, if they don't have stings, how do they defend themselves? One of the theories is that stingless bees, actually, they don't taste very good, so they don't have many predators. But another way that stingless bees protect themselves is that they often construct these very elaborate nest entrance tubes in front of the nest. So these tubes both serve as a landing platform for the workers which are returning to the hive, as well as a way to obstruct and block predators from entering the nest. And different species of stingless bee, as you can see here, actually construct different kinds of nest entrances. So moving on, I've just shared about the colonial bees and the hives that they build. So what about the non-colonial bees? Where do they nest and where do they live? So about half of these non-colonial bees, the solitary bees, they nest underground, and they'll build nests that consist of tunnels, whether it's in soil or in sand. Some of these solitary and semi-social bees, they also nest in wood. And sometimes they'll nest in wood like tree trunks, or they will nest in stems. So on the left here, you can see a small carpenter bee, the bottom left, an emerald small carpenter bee that's taken residence in this in a thin pitty stem. And if you were to look at a cross section of this stem, you can see what this bee has done is she's hollowed it out and used the pith almost the wood dust to build these cell partitions between the cells. She's gathered pollen and nectar and stored it inside the nest, inside the cell, and in a substance that scientists like to call bee bread. And she's laid an egg, and this egg will hatch into a young bee and feed on the bee bread. And it's all the bee needs to develop into an adult. So some bees nest inside wood. And lastly, some other kinds of bees also tend to nest in pre-existing cavities. So they don't take the trouble of making a hole, but instead they use holes that are already existing in the environment. So I'll be sharing about two kinds of bees that use this latter mode of nesting. The first group are one of my favorites, which are the leafcutter bees. So these bees really make their mark in the garden. So if you're walking around the garden and you look at some leaves, and you can see these, sometimes spot these regular cuts that are made along the edges of the leaf. And these aren't made by caterpillars or grasshoppers. You can tell because they are very regular and often oval or circular in shape. These are actually made by this group of bees, the leafcutter bees. So now I'll show a video of how these bees do their cutting. So this video is taken in the Singapore Botanic Gardens, and you can see a broad-headed leafcutter bee. She lashes onto the side of the leaf and starts cutting. So that was really quick. I'll play the video again. So you can see her working her way through the leaf, almost like a can opener. And within less than 10 seconds, she's cut this section of leaf and flown off with it. So yeah, these bees really have an amazing and interesting life history. So often, many of us might know of leafcutter ants, but leafcutter bees are new to us. So these bees will choose particular species of plants. And scientists think that they often choose plants that have antimicrobial properties because they build their nest with it. And these antimicrobial properties may be useful for protecting their young. So after cutting the piece of leaf, you can see in the bottom left image, she'll carry it to a pre-existing cavity and line it with the leaves. The next thing she'll do is that she'll visit flowers, such as this one, often from the legume family or the bean family, and she'll use a special way of triggering open the flower to expose the anthers and collect the pollen. And you can see one way that she's different from honeybees is that she doesn't collect pollen with her hind legs, but instead her pollen collecting hairs are underneath the abdomen, like on her belly. So she carries pollen there, and she'll bring it into her nest and provision each cell with a mixture of pollen and nectar. And the final result is what you see in the bottom right, something that looks like a popiah made of leaves. So so along here, there's actually a series of cells made of leaves, and within them, there'll be an egg and a mixture of pollen and nectar. Related to the leafcutter bees are resin bees. So these bees are from the same genus as the leafcutter bee. They're closely related, but instead of using leaves, they use resin instead to build their nest. What's quite interesting about this particular species of the resin bee, the disjunct resin bee, is that it's a very urban species, and they are often found nesting in places closest to us than we might expect. So in the top right image, you can see one of these disjunct resin bees has taken residence in one of the poles, bamboo poles that I was using for my laundry. And in the bottom image, you can see this same bee species nesting in the weep hole of a window on the 17th story of a flat. So these bees can actually be found in really urban environments as well. Some of these solitary bees that are found in Singapore are only known from Singapore. So one of these interesting bees is a very tiny species. You can see here, flying next to this honeybee in flight, is this Singapore plume-vented bee. It's a very tiny species, and when you first look at it, you might not expect it to be a bee. But when you look at it up close, you can see she's collecting pollen. So she's just about 4 millimeters long, and she's dark green and often very metallic in appearance. Very beautiful species. So this species is found quite commonly in neighborhoods and urban areas, and they have a fondness for palms. So if you have a palm in your neighborhood or in your garden, or local park, it's quite likely that you have these bees flying around. And in the bottom, we have probably Singapore's rarest bee, and one of the world's rarest actually. This is the Singapore comb sweat bee. And it's actually just known from only 2 specimens from the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve. The final group of bees that I'll be sharing about are the cuckoo bees. And these are probably the most surprising. So just like cuckoo birds, which sneak into the nests of other birds to lay the eggs, these bees do a very similar thing. They will find the nest of the host bee, sneak in, and also lay the eggs. So these bees, they don't take the trouble of building the nest or visiting flowers to collect pollen to provide food for their young, but instead they will steal a nest and sneak in and lay the egg in there. These cuckoo bees can be found in various bee families, and they often are quite specific when it comes to their hosts. So they will only use the nest of a particular bee species. So you can see on the right, different kinds of cuckoo bee species, and on the far right, different species of hosts that are related, that they will attack. The final myth that I'll share about today, probably the biggest, most important concern that some of us might have, is the idea that all bees are aggressive and dangerous. And because of that, it might be dangerous or unsafe to coexist with bees in our natural environment. But the truth is, the vast majority of bee species, especially the ones that I just shared about today, they're actually docile and unaggressive, even at the nests. So on the right here, you can see a picture of me and what I often do on my weekends. And it's spending time with bees outdoors in places where you can find them, in the habitats around, in a variety of different habitats, in parks and gardens, nature reserves, and looking at them at their nests or around flowers. And over my last 9 years of studying bees, I haven't even been close to actually being stung by one in the field. So bees are, as I mentioned, docile. And the last thing they want to do is really be involved in stinging you. So it is actually very safe for the vast majority of bees. The only exception is on the bottom left, the honeybees at their nest. So honeybees, when they're at their nest, if you were to disturb them, they will defend themselves and they will sting you. So that's the reason why when beekeepers who have to manage bees, honeybees, and work with honeybees and open up their nests, they do have to wear bee suits because they need to protect themselves from the stings. So honeybees, they are adapted to protect themselves against people who disturb their nests, often because they have many predators that are really interested in attacking them for their honey and for their bee larvae, including birds like the honey buzzard, as well as mammals like sun bears and honey badgers in Africa. So these bees are adapted to stinging mammals and protecting themselves when they're at the nest. So if you do see a honeybee hive, you should not approach it, and you should keep your distance from it, because these, as mentioned, these bees will sting if you disturb them. But actually, like all bees, honeybees, when they're foraging, whether it's at flowers or in this middle picture, visiting my hand to collect salts from my sweat, honeybees are actually docile as well. So all bees, when they're foraging at flowers, they have a totally different behavior where they are placid and unaggressive. So if you were to see a honeybee in your garden visiting flowers, you don't have to worry. It doesn't mean it won't be aggressive if you were to disturb it or by accident. So honeybees and all bees are actually safe, and you can safely go to your park and garden and observe these bees up close. Now that we've learned a little bit more about bees and understood them a bit better, how can we start helping them in our city and nature? Well, one of the best things that you could do is start growing a diversity of flowering plants, whether in your home garden, corridor garden, or your local community or allotment garden. And these gardens that you grow can include native plants, edibles, ornamentals, or plants that are known to be butterfly attracting, as these often are known to support bees as well. And by planting up your urban spaces, what you're doing is actually improving the ecological connectivity for pollinators, and a variety of other wildlife. And these allow wildlife to traverse between green spaces in our city. And on the right, you can see an example of a bee-friendly landscape on the roof of Kampong Admiralty. And you can see it comprises a variety of different plant species and different forms of plants, some climbers, some trees, and some shrubs as well. Another thing you can consider doing is constructing a bee hotel. So a bee hotel simply provides nesting spaces for docile solitary bees like leafcutter bees and resin bees, which I talked about earlier. So these are quite simple to build using materials that you can find at home or in your local nursery. And if you want to build one, you can watch this video that we've posted on our NParks Facebook page. The last thing you could do is start recording bees. So visit your local community garden or local parks and gardens and check out the flowers, and you'll often find bees there on a sunny morning. And use your phone or camera and take photos of these bees and submit them online to NParks Biodiversity Data Portal, known as SG BioAtlas. And you can download this app to your phone for free. By taking photos of these bees in your local areas and submitting them online, you're providing actually really crucial data that helps scientists like myself understand better the distribution of bees in Singapore and learn how to conserve them better. If you're not sure where to begin looking for bees, well, one place that I highly recommend is the HortPark Bee Trail. So this place is dedicated to the conservation and education of native bees, and it features both bee hotels as well as 3 distinct bee habitats in Singapore. And so far, we've recorded over 40 different bee species found here. And who knows, you might record even more. So I highly encourage everybody to start going to your gardens and looking at and seeing these amazing bees for yourself in person. All right, so I'm almost at the end of my talk. Thanks so much for listening. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today and you're excited to find out a bit more about bees in Singapore, I'm excited to share that I'm actually working on a book on the bees of Singapore. And it will include really interesting information on their biology, on the habitats, the flowers that they like to visit, as well as information on how to identify them or start creating your own bee-friendly habitat. So this book will be launched soon, and so look out for it. Another exciting news that I have is that the Festival of Biodiversity is happening next weekend, and it will kick off on the 5th of September. In addition to bees, the Festival of Biodiversity will be sharing a lot of interesting information on the flora and fauna of Singapore. And so do tune in to the festival and learn more there. So thank you so much for listening. And now I'll hand over the time to Leslie, who will be taking us through some Q&A.
Thank you, Zestin. So yes, we're moving on to the Q&A. We've got lots of questions from our participants. So just give me a moment to share them with our audience. Okay, so now on to our Q&A. The first question for you is, how far do bees fly from their nest to find their food?
Thanks. So this is an interesting question. Bees actually vary in the flight distances that they have from their nest to their foraging sites. Different bees will fly different distances. So the best study of these are the honeybees, which often fly between 1 to 5 kilometers from their hives to a place to collect pollen. But there's actually one species of honeybee found in Singapore as well, which is known to be highly migratory. This species is known as the giant honeybee, and it's known to fly hundreds of kilometers actually across regions in Asia to fly to different forests which are in bloom seasonally to collect floral resources. But some species of bees, especially the smaller solitary bees that I mentioned during this talk, they'll fly much shorter distances between maybe 200 meters to maybe 1 kilometer to 2 kilometers to collect pollen and nectar. So if you're setting up a bee-friendly landscape, you will need to set aside some nesting spaces that are near these food resources as well. in addition to flying far distances, bees also often fly really high up. And just over the circuit breaker, some people shared with me that while they were at home, they found bees. They saw bees actually flying up to their home on the 43rd story, visiting their flowers. So that's also really exciting. And in forests, trees grow really high up, and they will often flower really high as well. And these bees will fly really high to collect pollen and nectar.
Okay, so the answer to this question is that there is a whole range of distances depending on the species. Some just do a few kilometers, while there are migratory species that can go hundreds of km as well. Next question. What is your favorite bee?
So this is a tough one because in a way they're all my favorites. But I think the leafcutter bee is probably one of my favorites because I think I had the privilege of taking probably some of the first images and videos of a leafcutter bee in action in Singapore. And to me, that was a very special experience for me, and being able to see that and share that with people and surprise them that there are such fascinating insects in Singapore. Yeah, that has been very meaningful for me.
Okay, so to answer this question, which was not submitted by just one, but actually a few of our participants, it is the leafcutter bee, and that's because Zestin has had a wonderful experience of being able to document this species. Okay, the next question. Why are carpenter bees called carpenters?
So they're called that because they build their homes out of wood. They don't use hammers or nails, but instead they use their mandibles, which are their jaws, and they're very strong, and they'll use it to excavate through wood. The true carpenter bees, those big ones, would excavate through the bark and through hard wood. But the small carpenter bees, instead, they will rely on a twig that's been broken off, and they'll just excavate through the pith, which is softer part of the wood in the middle.
So carpenter bees excavate their homes out of wood using their strong mandibles or jaws. So in a way, they are like they work like similar to carpenters as we know them, hence the name. The next question for you. What should you do if you get stung by a bee?
Okay, so if you got stung by a bee, I think for most people, being stung by a bee doesn't cause much of a reaction. And what you want to do first, if it's a honeybee, the sting the stings of a honeybee is barbed, and often the sting will be left in your skin. So the first thing to do would be to remove that. And first aid will recommend that you use a card to scrape against the direction of where you were stung in order to remove the sting. Subsequently, you can treat it just like a normal cut. You can wash it and apply some antiseptic. But for minority of people, there are people who are allergic to it and will have severe reactions to them, also known as anaphylactic shock. So you do need to, so please do monitor yourself or have somebody monitor you and check if you are breathing properly, whether, and for signs and symptoms, whether you start swelling or if you start having problems, difficulty breathing, in which cases do see a doctor immediately. And if you do get stung by multiple bees, I highly recommend also seeing a doctor immediately. So often, as mentioned, this is really related to honeybees. If people were to accidentally disturb a hive by accident or step on a honeybee that's maybe crawling around on the ground barefooted, that's where people might get stung. And these are important things to note.
Okay, so I think as Zestin has mentioned earlier during his talk, most bees are actually unaggressive and docile, but if you do get stung, the first step is to remove the sting, preferably using a card and not, if I might add, not using your fingers, as you might accidentally squeeze the sting and release more venom in the process. And then after that, just treat it by washing with soap and water, apply antiseptic, but also do monitor in case of any allergic reactions like swelling or breathlessness. And if so, seek medical attention. Or if you are stung multiple times, then do try to get medical attention soon as possible as well. Moving on to the next question. What is the difference between bees and wasps?
So bees are really closely related to wasps, and many scientists or generally scientists consider bees to simply be vegetarian wasps. But bees are distinct in their own way. They are a unique group. So one of the ways that I mentioned in this talk is in their hairs. So if you look up close at the bees have branched hairs, whereas wasps, they only have simple hairs, which are unbranched. So hairs kind of like us, where there are no branches to the hairs. They don't look like feathers under a microscope. And the reason to that is related to their diet. So bees will rely on pollen as their main source of protein as young bees. So they will go to flowers, collect pollen, and feed their young with protein. Feed their young with the pollen, and they need it as protein to develop into adults. Whereas most wasps, they will actually collect, they are carnivorous and they would catch prey. So you have species of wasps in Singapore that catch spiders, they catch grasshoppers and caterpillars, and they'll bring them back to their to their nest, sometimes a hive, or if they're solitary, just a nest, and they'll use it to feed their young. So wasps are often carnivorous, whereas bees are vegetarian. So these are some of the major differences between bees and wasps generally.
Okay, so the key differences would be their diet. So Zestin mentioned bees being vegetarian, while wasps are carnivorous, and also the types of hairs. Okay, the next question. How do you tell the difference between a male and female bee?
So male and female bees, in certain species, they are very distinct in their color. But in certain species, they do look very similar. If you look at them really up close, they do have subtle differences. Male bees generally have additional antennal segment as well as an additional abdominal segment. So, those things can be hard to tell unless you have a specimen in hand and if you look at them really up close. What's easier is to look at their behavior. So only female bees do the work of collecting pollen and building the nest for their young, to look after the young. Male bees are not involved in that process at all. So if you see a bee going to a flower and collecting pollen, it's always a female. Whereas if you see a bee that's visiting flowers and only drinking nectar, it's quite likely to be a male. Associated to that is with the structures that a bee has. So female bees have pollen collecting structures because they collect pollen. So this could be in the form of a pollen basket or in specialized pollen collecting hairs known as scopa. Male bees don't have these structures because they don't collect pollen. Another thing that's a bit different, that's a difference between male and female bees, is that female bees are the only ones that have stings. So if you so happen, unfortunately, were to pick up a bee and get stung by one, that would be a female bee. Male bees do not have stings.
Okay, so some key differences that Zestin highlighted would be for some species, you can look at the colors, but for others, you would require a closer examination of like the physical structures. But in terms of behavior, pollinating bees tend to be female, and also only the female bees have stings. Next question. Okay, to round this up, tell us, what is one surprising thing about bees that you have found during your work with NParks?
I think the one thing that consistently surprises me is the great amount of things to continuously learn and discover about bees here in Singapore. I think just over the circuit breaker, where most of us, including myself, were at home, I think I didn't expect to learn more about bees, but I actually found out even more interesting things. So there was a person on Facebook that actually shared with me this really interesting sighting of bees that were soil nesting bees that were actually visiting her pots of plants in her balcony and actually nesting in these pots. And it was actually a really surprising and incredible thing because these solitary ground nesting bees, as far as I know, have never been documented nesting above ground. So it's kind of strange. You're finding a so-called ground nesting bee that nests in the soil, nesting above ground because it's nesting on a balcony. And so this could possibly be one of the first records in the world. And so we're trying to find out a bit more and doing a bit more research on that. And you can find out, and to discover that even during the circuit breaker was really surprising. Another thing was the idea that bees could fly really high up and in the process also pollinate plants that we're growing for our food. So people were growing tomatoes and honeydew on really high levels, like on the 43rd floor, on the 17th story. And you could even find bees going up to those levels and pollinating edible crops there. So there's still so much more to discover about bees, and they're consistently surprising me.
Thank you, Zestin. So there's always so much more to learn and discover. And as you highlighted, the circuit breaker did provide some unique circumstances to learn more. And sometimes even everyday observations can bring something new, which is why it's so important to be able to tell people about what we have, the biodiversity that we have, and to encourage them to also share with us what they see, such as through like SG Bio Atlas, which Zestin talked about earlier. Okay, thank you very much. We have a lot of questions, so I think Zestin has kindly shared with us some resources, which there will be a set of links shared in the chat really soon. And he has highlighted the important role that bees play in our environment and how they contribute to making our planet livable for all of us. And we can play a part in protecting them. At NParks, we have a systematic and multifaceted plan to conserve our biodiversity and transform Singapore into a city in nature. This is our Nature Conservation Master Plan. If you're interested to hear more, you can check out the links that will be shared in the Zoom chat soon, or watch our first NParks Spotlight talk on YouTube. In it, our group director, Lim Liang Jim, outlines this master plan. On our YouTube channel, you'll also find recordings of all our previous sessions for you to gain insight into the biodiversity around us. And if you enjoy these talks, do share them with your family and friends. And next month, the Festival of Biodiversity is back and we are going online. We have many exciting activities lined up for you from the 5th to the 26th of September. Webinars, habitat enhancements, BioBlitz. So do visit the webpage nparks.gov.sg/Festival of Biodiversity. This link will also be shared in the chat soon. Our annual celebration of Singapore's natural heritage features several of our partners who also play a key role in creating awareness and promoting the conservation of our biodiversity. And this year will be no different. Starting next Saturday, 5th September, our friends at the Herpetological Society of Singapore will be here from 10:30 to 11:30 to tell you all about the amazing reptiles and amphibians of Singapore. Animals like snakes and frogs might have a reputation of being scary or slimy, but many of them are actually harmless and play key roles in our environment. If you're curious to know more and want to have the chance to submit questions for our speakers to answer during the talk, then do register to join us on Zoom at go.gov.sg/NParksSpotlight-5SEP. Or you can stream the talk live on the NParksSG YouTube channel. Again, we will share the registration link with you in the chat. And with that, it leaves me to thank Zestin for the session and for our audience in both Zoom and YouTube for being with us today. Do share your feedback by scanning the QR code on my screen. We hope to see you again next week, but till then, have a great weekend, everyone. Take care and stay safe.